All right, so let's do part 2. Part 2. Any confusion, complication, ongoing questions, comments from part 1? All right, I'll take that as a no. Boom. All right. So now we're going to sort of make the transition from L1, which is what we've been talking about up to now, to L2. And the reason we're starting with L2 children is because that's exactly what happened in the field, right? So the field started out sort of mirroring L1, child language acquisition. Then it said, ooh, but maybe it's different for L2. So they started looking at children who were L2, right? And then eventually we moved to adults. So the first issue is, what's the difference between an L1 child and an L2 child? And your book sort of says anywhere between the ages of 2 and 9 or 4 and 9 or something like that. Basically, the sort of guideline is any child that already has a first language, so already has learned the language architecture for their, even if they can't produce all of it, basically they've been surrounded by one language since the moment they were born, okay, up until the age of maybe 4 or 5, okay. That is successive language learning, meaning that that child is an L2 learner, not an L1, not a bilingual. So simultaneous bilingualism is if you're doing 2 languages in the same environment, all right? Now, the age issue is complicated, and we are going to come back to the age issue in the book. There are a number of ways in which people have approached the age issue. A lot of people who believe in innate principles of language say that it's exactly the same. It's a unitary process, L1 and L2, regardless of whether you're a child or an adult, and that it's other things that interfere with that mean that you don't become the same kind of speaker usually in your second language. But as I say, we're going to look at more detail in that. The data in this part of the chapter on 119 should have looked super familiar, because it was the data that you looked at in your language analysis. It was the little Japanese girl and the little Norwegian boy. So that gives you an idea as to the kind of things that I was looking for you to say. You know, it starts out talking about what we talked about in class, right? We talked about unanalyzed chunks, and what do they call it in the book? Huh? Someone say something out loud, I can't hear you.
Prefabricated routine.
Good, a prefabricated routine. So that was the idea of the, what are you, right? The are you? Do you, thank you, the do you. Yeah, the do you thing, right? That that in fact she hasn't learned that needs to be divided up, okay? So Dulay and Burt were the first people to start looking at children learning in L2, okay? Along with these people, Hakura, and who was the one that did the Japanese, and Ravam, who was the one that did the Norwegian child. And note that these kids I think the Japanese, I can't remember now. What was the Japanese was 6 or 7?
The other way around.
The other way around. Japanese was
4 and 6.
4 and 6. Okay, good. Yeah. So what they said was that children are using this innate thing, and what they call it is creative construction. Okay. What that means is that they look at the data, they look at the input that they have, and they start hypothesizing what should be happening. Okay. Now, when you learn your first language, the idea is when you learn your first language, you're doing all of that subconsciously, if you like. There's no 1-year-old that says, wait, I think that I just heard an irregular past tense, right? But as you get older, you might do this more and more consciously, right? You also might have a quicker idea of how some rules can be reconstructed. For example, if your language has regular past and irregular past, and you've learned that already, then when you're faced in your second language as a kid with an irregular past and a regular past, it might be that that rate increases, right? Because you've already understand that concept that there might be a regular and an irregular. So what they said is that children reconstruct rules, just as you were watching them do in the data analysis, that they're doing this using universal mechanisms, and we'll come back to that. And essentially what they're doing is trying out language hypotheses. So again, the simple example is the idea of a past tense. They try and make everything regular, then they realize it isn't regular. So until mismatches are resolved, in that case it would be they finally work out that there are some regular and irregular past tenses. And that was their idea of what second language children are doing, right? So in order to test this, they did what's called the morpheme order studies using the BSM. Now, why would they choose to do morpheme order studies, do you think? Very straightforward answer. Don't make it too complicated.
Because they get complicated.
The
simple parts of language are learned first.
Who else did morpheme order studies?
Oh. Skinner?
Brown, right? The L1 guy. Yeah. So this is once again another like, okay, if we have a look at first language acquisition morpheme order studies that Brown did, those 8 inflectional morphemes that we looked at, and we can come up with an order for L1 children, let's have a crack at doing that with L2 children, right? And see if we can also come up, and let's see if that is the same order that L1 children have or a different one. Because if it's the same order, then maybe it proves this idea of a unitary process, right? It doesn't matter if it's your L1 or your L2 if you're a kid. You're still using the same mechanisms to learn, right? So the way they did that was using the BSM. You should be looking at the BSM right now on page 122. Are we all looking at the BSM? And that's the bilingual syntax measure. We looked at it real briefly the other day. So if you look underneath the picture, for example, the experimenter might say, what are these? And the learner says, houses, right? At that point, you say, check. The learner has applied the plural morpheme correctly has put an S and said it's 2 houses as opposed to 1 house. Thus, this learner has acquired the plural marker. Does that make sense? Think of the other questions she did in the WOG test, okay? Or you can think like, what is this house doing, right? It looks like he's blowing or something, I don't know. So we can say this house is blowing, right? Or I guess they do it with he eats too much, he's fat. It's a fat guy's house. I don't know. You can see it all on 5.2. And this is what I meant, Diego, when I said standard. So in the BSM, they include the article system and pronoun case and singular form of to be, as well as the 8 grammatical morphemes, right? So what did they find? They found that an order occurred similarly across languages, and you can see that on the next page on 123. So they tested Chinese kids and Spanish kids, and they found that they did roughly the same thing in the same order at the same rate, right? So what does that suggest?
Unitary.
It's unitary, universal, right? That it doesn't matter whether you're, at least while you're a kid, it doesn't matter if you're already speaking Spanish or already speaking Chinese, right? It's going to be, this is the way you're going to learn the morphemes, okay? So once they'd done that, they then decided, you know what? Let's do this with adults. So they had a similar kind of experiment, and they did the same kinds of BSM measures with adult second language learners. And what did they find? They found that it again occurred similarly across languages. It also occurred similarly across ages. In other words, the kinds of productions that the adult learners were making were similar to the kinds of constructions that the children were making, right? And that the differentiation in rate could be based on the native language, meaning, for example, if your native language has articles, you're more likely to pick up articles quicker because you have you understand what an article system is. Whereas if your language doesn't have articles, you don't understand what an article system is necessarily. And you can see all these tables and studies that they've given you, right, with the morpheme order that ends up with this general finding, right? Such that at the end of it, they posited what they called a natural order hypothesis, which simply means there is a natural / universal order in which these morphemes are acquired. Okay? Natural meaning it doesn't matter if you try and present it differently in a classroom or whatever, it will still be learned in that order. Does that make sense? You understand the natural order? Okay, so it's going to come back and bite. Okay, now this research was all done pretty much in the 70s and 80s. And you might, as you read in the chapter, it's come under quite a lot of criticism since then. So the criticism is all in your book, But essentially, typical criticisms are that the BSM, the test itself, ends up producing the kind of results that you expect. The reason it's the same for everybody is because it's an artifact of the test, as opposed to an artifact of the way that we learn language. If you have any interest in looking in more detail at these criticisms, they give you plenty of suggested reading. I'm not going to go through in any more detail than they do. Criticisms of unclear groupings of languages. In other words, in some studies they have Spanish and non-Spanish, and non-Spanish is like a million different things, you know, from Chinese to Nepalese, so you can't really tell. Inclusions of things that are not strictly speaking grammatical morphemes, like for example the article system. And then what I've always thought was the really interesting criticism. Okay, remember how they... Okay, someone say back to me how the BSM says you've acquired. What do the learners have to do for you to say, check, they've acquired it?
You have to produce the form of the morpheme.
Right, where?
Of when you get asked.
Right, in a required context, right? So if I say how many, you have to say how many wugs, you have to say 2 wugs, right? In other words, in response to my how many wugs, it's a required obligatory context for you to say wugs, right? Same with houses. What are these? Houses, right? It's required. But what it doesn't do is count how often they produce it when they didn't need to. Do you see what I mean? In other words, how often are they overproducing a morpheme in a situation where it shouldn't be there? They don't count that, okay? So if you counted that and they're using S incorrectly in non-obligatory context, so in other words, I say, is that one, and they say 1 wugs, okay? Now they're producing the S incorrectly, in the sense that it's not supposed to be there. So the question really becomes, what counts as acquisition, right? So is a morpheme acquired when it is A, used in obligatory context, and B, not used when it shouldn't be? I think most people would argue that that sounds like acquisition, right? Not just that you can use it when you should, but that you don't use it when you shouldn't, because otherwise you could be using it everywhere, and that's the reason you're doing so well, because you're just sort of hitting it every time you're supposed to, because you're putting it everywhere. So that's the real criticism that has come up in terms of the methodology. But there's also the fact that a lot of people don't like the sort of randomly large number of grouping of languages, and as we say, sort of Spanish and non-Spanish, which could be a million other things. There's no qualitative studies of this, meaning someone sat down and gone through the data person by person, learner by learner. So what that means is we only know the aggregate, not what individual differences might appear, okay? But yet we know that individual differences are really important in language learning, so should we be looking at, and in fact, these old studies, we don't even have, I'm not even sure that data is available. So, and there are other possible, we've said that the implication, right, of this the fact that you have this same order occurring across, the implication is that there's some kind of unitary process, right? But there could be other factors involved in that. One, for example, one very important one could be input frequency. You know, how often do they hear that morpheme in the input that they have? Like, do they hear S more frequently? Do they hear the plural S more frequently than they hear the ing, for example, or something like that? So does that mean that they are more likely to acquire them in a certain order? There's also the complexity of the concept itself. So I don't think anyone would argue that the complexity of one wog and two wugs is less complicated than the idea of ing, okay, of present participle, for example, and how if something is in motion or even not in motion, you need to use the ing, right? So there's the idea that you might be comparing apples to oranges when you're comparing these morphemes, right? Then there's perceptual salience. Is it easier to hear the ing than it is to hear an S? Okay, for example, that's flipping the other way around. So if you, especially considering S's change their pronunciation, why do plural S's change their pronunciation? Good, whatever comes before. So if it's voiced, so it's houses, and if it's unvoiced, cats, right? So maybe that's not perceptually very salient. So you can see that you can make arguments for all kinds of things here that could be factors in how children are. And then there's relationship to NL, that's for things like pronoun case and article system. So it's difficult to, now what's happened is since the 1980s, a lot of people have argued that these things are more important than we ever realized. Input frequency, perceptual salience, and so on. So I wouldn't want you to think any of these things are resolved. At this point, we're on a chronological journey through what we think we know and what we don't know. Okay, so all right, does that make sense? Okay, so this is great, right? You've got a bunch of people doing first language acquisition with kids, a bunch of people doing second language acquisition with kids. I already told you Chomsky was not interested in language acquisition of any description other than, you know, the fundamental architecture. People like Brown were psychologists, they weren't linguists. No one was really working it for the second language acquisition field until along came Stephen Krashen. So Stephen Krashen in the 80s, who is someone who other people out, my 19 people out there, might have some familiarity with, because he's still, the natural approach, which was his approach with Terrell, is still has some traction in foreign language teaching. It doesn't really have any traction in applied linguistics, but it still does in foreign language teaching, and textbooks are still available. And Stephen Krashen himself is still wandering across the United States giving talks about the reading approach and the natural approach and so on. So, but he started in the 1980s and he said, aha, I can turn this into a theory of second language acquisition, right? So I can take all this stuff that other people have put together and I can work it into a principled theory of second language acquisition for children or adults, not bilingual, but second language acquisition for children or adults by creating these 5 hypotheses that make up the monitor model, okay? So what you've got there in the beginning is how an innatist view of L2 might work, taking into account hypotheses that he and others had generated up until that time, okay? He was the first one that said, I like this idea of an innatist second language acquisition model, and I can use it to teach. It is no longer accepted. Oh, there's a little principles might work. Oh, that should be due, not do. No longer accepted as a credible account of how these principles might work due to the lack of empirical support, right? So we need to be clear that at this point, Krashen is not somebody that you'd want to use this particular theory for your thesis or your dissertation because it's long been discredited. But what it did do was say, this is the beginning of a construction of innate-based cognitive approaches to SLA, right? Because prior to that, what did we have?
Behaviorism.
Good, Diego, if you're still on fire. Yeah, prior to that, the only thing we had in language acquisition was the idea of imprinting and imitation, right? So he came, now this is why he's such a big deal, because he did this thing, right? Not necessarily because we agree with anything that he actually said. So the monitor model, you've got details on the monitor model starting on page 129. It's the rest of your chapter. And I just wanted to make sure that you understood the general idea. So it's 5 separate hypotheses that make up the model. And you have his name for it and then my name for it, okay? So, but let's not sort of tell anybody else that these are my names for it. So the first one is the acquisition versus learning hypothesis. Does anyone remember what that said from their reading?
Children acquire second language. Learn.
No, way more complicated than that. For once, it's more complicated. That's okay. So acquisition versus learning hypothesis says that when you're a second language learner, now again, we're talking about second language learners, children and adults are all under one umbrella for Krashen, right? That you can either acquire the language or you can learn the language, okay? And what you want to do is acquire it, because that's what children do. First language children do. And if you learn it, it goes into a different place. So this is my garden wall in the brain. Okay, I don't know how well we can, but essentially, and this is an oversimplification, but true, what Krashen says is that if this is your brain, if you acquire language, you can't see. What did someone say?
No, I said sorry because I yawned. It's just.
Oh, okay. If you acquire language, it goes in this side of the brain. And if you learn language, it goes in this side of the brain. And never the twain shall meet. Okay? There's basically what I call a garden wall, which is obviously not a garden wall. And you guys don't even talk about garden walls, but what do you call fence, I guess? A yard, a fenced yard between your acquired language and your learned language, okay? And the best thing that you can have, just down in circles, is your acquired language, because that's how children do it. You know, we talked about the integral nature of learning language while you're learning about the ontology of the world. That's how you want to learn it. But most people don't learn it that way, right? Because how do most people learn their second language, particularly as adults? In a classroom. So they learn their second language, right? And if you learn your second language, that brings it all kinds of problems, which we come back up in the other hypotheses. So hold on to that thought for a second. The second hypothesis that he chooses is the natural order hypothesis. Now that's not his, right? Whose is that? Those other guys.
Order status, delay and part.
Yes, Delay and Burt. That's absolutely right. That's this. But what he says is, ooh, look at this. This is a great, this shows that it's true, that there is an innate set of principles that children and adults in a second language use. And if we could just let them acquire it, if we would just stop messing with them and let them acquire it, then they would be just as good in their second language as they are in their first language. But we don't. What we do is we mess with the system, right? We don't let them learn it naturalistically, or they learn it as an adult in a classroom. So this brings us to the monitor hypothesis, which I call the I can't lose this argument hypothesis, because what the monitor says is anything that is learned and not acquired is subject to what he calls the monitor. That thing that you've got in your book, that long, it's on page 130. And what the monitor does is sort of stop your production and make sure you check it. So it stops the spontaneity that you need, that you have with the acquired language. Okay? Like children don't have a monitor when they learn their first language, right? They acquire their first language. If you learn it, then there's a possibility that this monitor, well, it's definitely going to have, according to him, that this monitor comes to play. And what does that mean? Well, it means you may never be completely fluent in your second language, because this monitor is messing with your brain, right? In all kinds of different ways, and they talk about them in the book. But basically, the reason I call that I can't lose this argument is this explains now why some people are really crap at language and some people aren't, right? According to him. That if we just left everybody alone and let them acquire it, we'd all be just as brilliant in our second language as our first, because we're following these innate principles, right? But as soon as we start messing with it, then we produce this monitor, and then we're really in trouble. So if you want to acquire it, which is the good thing, this is where we get the input hypothesis. What the input hypothesis says is acquisition not learning, occurs if you go +1 level each time. Okay, so let's take something like let's go back to here. Let's say, I can't remember, but let's say the first inflectional morpheme that you acquire as a child, well, actually you can look it up, look it in your book. What does it say is the first one they acquire? But based on those charts. So now we're looking at first language children's charts.
Present progressive.
Present progressive, right. So the first one we do is the present progressive, right? And then what's the second one, Diego?
Oh, that's perfect. But
so we're going back to the original charts for L1 children. For children, it's way back before the bilingual syntax measure.
Yeah.
It's
Pronoun thing, article.
okay. Where are we?
123.
Okay, great. Pronoun, then article, then progressive. Pronoun, article, progressive. So if you say that it's pronoun, article, progressive, then that's your +1. In other words, once you've learned the pronoun, your +1 level is the next one in the natural order. And then the +1 again is the next one in the natural order. Okay. Not unreasonable, except for what is the +1 level of input if you're not talking about morpheme order, right? So the natural order hypothesis only covers morpheme acquisition, right? Now, people have done other work in question formation, which you looked at, and in relative clause formation. But basically, most of the syntax and morphology that we have, God alone the phonology, has never been tested like this, right? So if he's saying that the way that you help a person acquire a language is by only to produce these +1 levels, now you've got no objective way to say what a +1 level is, other than the BSM studies, which anyway people are saying are problematic, right? All right. Then the last one is the affective filter hypothesis, or the now I really can't lose hypothesis, because what that says is even if you've done your very best job and you've learned it and your monitor isn't messing with you, the affective filter, the thing that makes you feel nervous, anxious, hesitant, can be very high. And when that's very high, you can't produce the learned language. So basically, it doesn't matter what my second language learner produces, Crash and says, well, could be a higher affective filter. Okay. Could be you've got the wrong +1. Could be that he's monitoring, she's monitoring, right? But none of these things have been proven. Diego.
I thought affective filter was more about what goes into the student than what comes out in terms of what they learn, not what they produce.
Well, it could be both. The affective filter, yes, stops the, yes, good. So you're absolutely right. The affective filter is the filter that stops the input going into the acquired language. Good, yes, you're absolutely right. So it's actually here. Good, well done. That was completely wrong of me and completely right of you. So this is why, in fact, this is why I call it the now I really can't lose hypothesis. Because even if it's acquired, which should mean that you now talk like a first language child, if your affective filter is too high, you're not going to be able to acquire that input. Good, thank you. So basically what that means is he's pretty much can cover anything, right? It could be that you have acquired the language, but that you still can't use it because of the affective filter, or that you've learned the language, which is bad because then it gets affected by the monitor. And either way, you're never going to be like an L1 speaker. Does that make sense? So what he came up with was a approach which we call the natural approach or the reading approach, which is what he's still banging around the States doing. And what he says is that you provide enormous amounts of input for the students, and in order to help them acquire, and you work out some way what the +1 would be in everything, or you use his very expensive books to tell you, and you don't teach any grammar. You let them acquire the grammar. And why do you not teach any grammar?
Because it's cognitive, it doesn't have to be explicit.
What happens if you teach grammar? In this model, what happens if you teach grammar?
They learn it, they don't acquire it.
Yes, exactly. They learn it, they don't acquire it. And what happens if they learn it?
If they learn it, they'll have to monitor their speech.
Yes. If they learn it, they'll have the monitor, and the monitor will stop them using it properly. And at no point can they move from learning it to acquiring it, because there's a gum wall in the middle of the brain that stops them doing that. Okay. What do we think of this model?
It's depressing.
It's depressing.
Yeah.
Well, so what he says is the way to get around it is to, we're doing lots of things wrong, right? We shouldn't be learning, we shouldn't be explicitly learning grammar, things like that. That's all getting in the way of this acquisition. Any other thoughts about the model?
I like some parts of it. Like I like the input hypothesis, the 1+, but not for beginner levels. Like when we talked about, the AR test or the AR books that were ranked in the difficulty of the book.
Okay.
You want to go a level higher so that you understand the complexities of sentences. But when it comes to actual grammatical pieces,
right,
it's hard to tell which one's more difficult than others, or where the student is and what they actually know.
Yeah, so this is one of the real problems, right? If you're saying, okay, how do I put this into practice in my classroom? How do you know where the students are and where you're supposed to go next, right? You have to rely on his pre-worked out curriculum. What else? What do we think about this garden wall in the brain, those of us that have learned more than one language?
Well, I'm not very good at any second language. So
You're not very good?
at any second language.
Right.
So that would suggest the existence of this.
So you like the garden wall in the brain?
Well, no, I don't. I think that I don't. I think that he's obviously there's some things that are accurate.
Yeah.
About what he's saying.
Uh-huh.
The thing that I have a problem with is he seems to think that the learning is always somehow subverting
Yes.
the acquisition.
Yes.
I would take a less negative view and say it's not subverting it, it's just not adequate by itself.
Right. So,
It's like learning is mustard and acquisition is the cheeseburger. You can't live on mustard alone, but it does make the cheeseburger better if you incorporate it.
I have never thought I might forget the garden wall and go with the mustard and the cheeseburger. Yes, absolutely. And what you're talking about is you're sounding like someone who is more likely to be sympathetic to information processing models, which basically says we can move from cognitive processing to automatic processing. That if we do it long enough, we can do this in language as well.
Because we do it with other types of knowledge.
Right. This has been the big, so in other words, there is no garden wall. It may be that what he's talking about is cognitive versus automaticity, and that in fact, given the right conditions, it can all be one big.
Right. We all drive a car automatically, having learned it, having it be very difficult at first.
Yeah.
But now we do it without thinking.
So that's always been my biggest, I mean, I literally remember writing notes in my first second language seminar many years ago, and I had this big wall, this thing, I was like this big question mark, and I was like, this can't possibly be true. It just can't. Because, you know, over and above the fact that some of us get incredibly skillful at our second language, you know, I know that when I was speaking Hungarian, particularly if I'd had a glass of wine, I could get quite fluent, you know, and produce, you know, phrases as opposed to single words, right? So it just didn't work for me. And it's one of the things that's caused but of course, it also can be used to explain, you know, if you follow this, you can say, well, this is why second language learning children in schools never get as good as their, you know, older second language learning children, or adults never get. The other thing I have a problem with is the idea of learning getting in the way. So, for example, if I think, and I don't know how many of you have had this experience in your second language, but one of the things that Hungarian does is have these horrible little affixes at the end of things. So you'd say a word, and then there'd be this little no, or, you know, but at the end, and I'd be like, what is that? I mean, you know, like, what is that? I could never work out what that thing was, right? So I couldn't work out when I was supposed to use it, when I wasn't supposed to use it. So I had a class one day with one of the other Hungarian teachers in Hungarian, and I said, look, what is this thing? You know, she's like, oh, it's a postposition. It means, I forget what it means now, but it means X or Y. So I said, oh, so you put it there when it's something that's in the pluperfect or whatever. And she's like, yes, that's exactly right. I was like, oh, right, okay. Now I know what that little thing is. Now I know what it's supposed to be doing, right? To me, that was hugely reassuring. So the fact that I'd explicitly learned it didn't seem to me to be a problem in terms of acquiring it. Now, of course, that could be my bias, but I don't know how you...
I agree with you. Not just for brownie points.
You're not just for brownie points. You're racking them up, though, today, Diego. Anybody have any...
I think there's even cases with one's first language where you learn a rule that helps you understand something that wasn't quite clear.
Yeah. Can you give us a...
Let's see, what do people in English always get wrong? So what do we get wrong here in the U.S.?
Well, one thing that's an excellent example is could have, right? So if you look at either children or some of our freshman composition where they've never really worked that through, when they hear I could have gone, they write could of, right? Because they're confusing the phonology and the syntax, right? They don't realize that could have, which sounds like of, is actually have, right? Could have, yeah. that's a pretty good example where you like, oh wait, okay, it's not of, it's have, and it's the short version of have, right? So anyway, yeah. So joking aside, the fact that I look at this stuff, you know, the real important thing is this part, in the sense that Krashen was the first one to come along and say, yeah, you know what, we can use this stuff. We can use this idea of innate, universal mechanism to explain systematic parts of second language acquisition. So in that sense, he had a massive impact on making second language acquisition something that now we do as TESOL teachers, if you see what I mean. Like, it's now no longer, if it had just been Chomsky had no interest in how this might affect teaching or learning or anything else, right? He was literally just interested in the architecture of the brain. With Krashen's theory, however flawed that theory and monitor model may be, he said, look, there's a way to make this apply to the classroom. And that was a huge leap forward. And the other thing was, this is now the beginning of discussions that have led to really continuingly important concepts in SLA, okay? So one is, for example, this idea of input has now been expanded to include output, right? So whereas Krashen was very concerned with the input and how the brain worked on the input, more recent times in the 90s and 2000s, people have said it's not just the input, you've also got to output it in order for it to be learned, right? It's what's called the interaction hypothesis. So you have to produce output and interaction, and that solidifies the stuff, basically. So input alone isn't good enough, but the notion of input was a good start. Affective variables, this idea of either production or perception. So in, you know, if you expand out from Krashen's idea of the affective filter, we now look at affective variables across the board. Like, how do they affect how we learn? How do they affect how we produce language? You know, is there an ideal language learner? And what affective variables go into producing an ideal language learner? Like, is there an ideal level of anxiety that will allow you to push forward but not stop you, not paralyze you? Is there an ideal personality type, you know, that as an adult would mean that you stood better chance of doing, you know, if you're an extrovert, is that better than being an introvert? All this kind of thing. So affective variables have become more and more important. And also this idea of classroom versus naturalistic learning. I mean, even if we say that this idea of a garden wall seems sort of extremely unlikely, there still is this idea that first language learners, so children who are learning their first language, have this whole bubble around them of learning the world, learning the concepts, learning the language. If you move that into the classroom and you no longer have that, you also no longer have anything like the same kind of quality of input, right? So now your quality of input is reduced down to me standing here talking at you for 2 hours, right? Which is nothing like being able to experiment with the language in a way you could as a first language child, right? So these are things that we've continued to look at and that he has given us. But the model itself, because it's untestable, because basically you can never tell exactly what it is, right? It could be the affective filter stopping the input. It could be the monitor stopping the output. It could, there's no sort of way to test any of these things. Then that in and of itself is an unusable, for most of us, for applied linguistics, it's now considered to be an unusable proposition. So let's have a look at the summary on page 135. Make sure that we don't have any questions. Field of SLA has been closely tied to L1 acquisition from the beginning. Children all follow similar patterns in L1, developing rule-based systems that are not necessarily affected by error correction. Child SLA refers to children who learn L2 between the ages of 5 or 9, when the primary language is mostly settled. Before we have the effects of a critical or sensitive period, we'll come back to that. L1 to L2 hypothesis refers to the idea that child SLA is similar to child L1 acquisition. That's a hypothesis, a theory, not a proven, and in fact, we've shown that that's problematic. A mentalist approach, so we're calling it a cognitive approach, posits that the processes of acquisition are the same, regardless of the NL or the language being learned. And the monitor model marked a change from the field of behaviorist explanations to more innatist perspective. And I would add, it was the thing that brought it into the classroom because it came with the natural approach, which up until then had not brought it into the language classroom. Questions? Comments?
So it's Krashen or Freud?
See, I'm not a psychologist. Is Freud?
He's the guy who was doing the analysis.
No, I know he's that you always want to kill your father and screw your mother or something. Yeah, right. But so no one believes in Freud anymore?
Well, none of his theories, I don't want to say none, most of them were not testable.
Right.
But he did bring psychology into the forefront of, hey, this is something we can study. Yeah, I think that's a fair analogy as far as that goes. I don't know anything about Freud, but yeah, absolutely. I think up until then, people had not necessarily put a theoretical bent behind their teaching practice. And this suggested that, in fact, there was one. We just didn't know what it was. Yeah. People just taught until they either learned it or quit.
Yes, that's exactly right. We either taught them with things like grammar translation, we either taught them until we learned it or quit, right? Generally speaking, they quit. Yeah. So, in fact, if you learned the language to a point where you could use it, then you were, an extraordinary, in the same way now that we look at learners like Dr. Tardo, for example, who, although still has some phonology issues that I point out whenever I can, essentially is native-like in all his reactions in English now. His mother is the same. His father couldn't do it. His mother and his father did the same things. They sat in that flat in Italy and they did the same things. His mother is excellent. His father never could. His father has passed, but when he never could. So what is that? Now up until we had things like this, it was like, well, it's a crapshoot. Good luck. Maybe you're Sal's mom, maybe you're Sal's dad. Too bad. Now what we're trying to do is put in some of this back mechanism to say, how can we describe that empirically?
and assess that empirically, and hopefully maybe, you know, improve people's experience. Yeah. Any other comments? This all made some sense. Do you see how this relates to your data analysis? Right, so this is also this idea of moving from random observations about your learner to really looking at what might be happening in a given learner's system. Well, then in that case, I'm going to let you all go. So thank you very much. Thank you to everybody out there. And I will see you next week.